Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Forum on the Humanities and the Public World sponsored by the Townsend Center for the Humanities. My name is Tony Cascardi and I'm the director of the center. The forum is designed to showcase the work of prominent intellectuals, writers, and artists insofar as their work has a tangible bearing on our shared public lives. While the case could be made that everything we do in the humanities and as humanists contributes to the process of negotiating and shaping public life, there are some figures whose work illustrates this in particularly compelling ways. Our speaker this afternoon, Tzvetan Todorov, is precisely such a person. Born in Bulgaria and living in France since 1963, Todorov has published some 21 books during the course of a long and brilliant career. Books including The Poetics of Prose, The Conquest of America, Facing the Extreme, Hope and Memory, and Imperfect Garden, The Legacy of Humanism. Among his best-known contributions to literary theory was his work articulating the principles of narrative structure and his fine-grained discrimination of various forms of the fantastic, including the fantastic uncanny and the fantastic marvelous. Many of you, I'm sure, know him in those contexts. But as the brief list of publications I mentioned suggests, his range is considerably broader than this. His work happily, and I would say necessarily, blurs the lines between literary theory, cultural theory, and philosophy. Witness his book on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Frail Happiness, which asks about nothing less than whether happiness is possible in the modern age. In one of his major works, Facing the Extreme, Tzvetan Todorov calls for a reevaluation of some of the basic conceptions about humanity and human nature on the basis of the extreme situations of the Nazi concentration camps and the Soviet gulags. General opinion, supported by the testimony of some survivors, had been that the camps and gulags produced the truly horrific Hobbesian situation of a war of all against all, that in these conditions all traces of moral life evaporated as men became beasts locked in merciless struggle for survival. Simply to survive, the general supposition was all dignity and conscience had to be sacrificed. However, in his reading of actual survivor testimonies, Todorov says the picture may not be so radically bleak, that there are also hopeful examples to attend to, examples of inmates helping one another, demonstrations of compassion in human relationships despite the inhumane conditions and terror. On some occasions, at least, it seems that survival depends not upon competition with others, but upon their help. Tzvetan Todorov's many honors include the Bronze Medal of the CNRS, the Charles Levesque Prize of the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, the first Montjean Prize of the Académie Française, and the Prince of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. He has been a visiting professor at many institutions, including Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and indeed the University of California at Berkeley. It's a great pleasure to welcome him back today. The title of his talk this afternoon is posed in the form of a question: Memory, a remedy for evil? Please welcome Tzvetan Todorov.
Thank you for this generous introduction. I will start immediately with trying to answer this question. And my beginning will be a reminder of the most frequently recited Christian prayer in the world, the one that begins with an address to God as our Father who art in heaven, and which ends with a petition fraught with meaning: deliver us from evil. This implies that there is an evil element in human nature from which God can free us, and we pray that he will do so. Human beings, as we know, have sometimes been tempted to take upon themselves this purifying role, and we are well aware of the catastrophic results to which such ambitions have led in totalitarian regimes. Democracy don't engage in such projects of definitively eliminating evil. Yet impulses in this direction exist here and there, and one of them takes the form of an appeal to memory. The presumption being that if we remember the evil committed in the past, we can avoid it today. The most commonly quoted statement in this regard is the one made by George Santayana: "Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it," which gives us to understand, firstly, that the past in question was bad and its return unwelcome, and secondly, that if we remember it, then we are sure to avoid repeating it, and consequently, we can escape evil. No forgiving, no forgetting is often to be seen scrawled on city walls. Never again, people shout in meetings, while on TV they speak to us sententiously about the duty to remember, repentance, reparations, all in the hope that such gestures will redress a wrongful past. Thus understood, memory has even had the good fortune of being introduced in the arena of law. A number of European countries have adopted so-called memorial laws that inscribe the interpretation of one or another painful ordeal from the past into the code of criminal procedure to safeguard its memory against attacks and maintain its effectiveness against evil. These laws abound in France in particular. The so-called Guessot law, adopted in 1990, punishes anyone who contests the existence of such crimes against humanity as the Nazi extermination of the Jews. A law approved in 2001 states that the massacres of the Armenians in Turkey in 1915 must be qualified as a genocide. Another, at the same time, declares that slavery and the slave trade are also crimes against humanity, and as such, their memory is untouchable. Emboldened by this run of decisions, in 2005, the members of the French Parliament voted in a memorial law that this time commemorated what they considered to be a praiseworthy rather than a painful event, that is, French colonization of North Africa. As we can see, the appeals to memory as an effective cure against evil are not in short supply. The past is well preserved and commemorated. Yet, if we shift our gaze to the present, there is no reason to conclude that evil is generally on the decline on the surface of our planet. Whatever men and women in different periods have usually designated by this term seems to have survived intact from all the efforts to fight evil with memory. And it continues today probably with even greater force. Wars, genocides, massacres, torture, rape, violence of all kinds, sufferings inflicted and endured stubbornly persist in our midst. No sooner have they been stopped in one place than they start up in another, and one would be hard put to discern a collective moral progress in the march of humanity. Thus, the memory remedy seems to be ineffective. But before simply giving up on it, it may be worth examining more attentively. What if we are going about it the wrong way, and the problem resided not in recourse to memory and to the past, but in the specific role that we want to make them play and the conclusions that we drove from them? To clarify the matter, allow me first to remind you the constituent components of a narrative that takes up the theme of good and evil. In them, we observe two processes, the production of evil and that of good, along with two protagonists, the one who acts and therefore conducts the process, and the one who endures it. This allows us to identify from the outset four main roles. On the one hand, the villain, the wrongdoer, and his or her victim. On the other, the hero and his or her beneficiaries. Two of these roles are regarded with respect and consideration, the hero and the victim. The former does good, the latter endures an injustice that might be righted. Two other roles are held in low esteem, the passive beneficiary of deeds accomplished by someone else, and especially the villain, who serves as a foil. Add to this basic pattern the distinction between us, our community, or simply those who resemble me or are close to me, and them, those who are foreign and different, the enemies, and you have the majority of uses of memory, which consist in attributing to ourselves the appealing, respected role of hero and victim, and confining others to the less glorious roles of villain, criminal, and executioner, or of passive recipients of our heroic deeds. There is something suspicious about this unanimity. What if the sterility of calls to remember were rooted in this constant identification with heroes and victims and the extreme distance we put between the miscreants and ourselves? I will examine now briefly two examples. The first one is one of the most traumatic events of the 20th century, and I'm thinking of the genocide perpetrated in Cambodia between 75 and 79, in the course of which the Khmer Rouge killed nearly a quarter of the population. In 2008, last year, a trial started in Phnom Penh for crimes against humanity, against some of the surviving senior members of the party, and against a certain Duch, I'll pronounce his name that way, I'm not too competent on the right way pronouncing it. Duch, in a separate trial, the one that already started, the director of the sinister S-21 torture and execution camp located in Tuol Sleng. A very singular witness to these events was French ethnologist François Bizot, who was imprisoned by the Khmer Rouge in October 71 when he was in Cambodia working on the Buddhist traditions in the Indo-Chinese peninsula. The Vietnam War was in full swing at the time, and the Khmer Rouge controlled only part of the territory. Bizot was accused of being an American spy, and the leader of the group that detained him was none other than Duch. Under constant threat of death, the French ethnologist was eventually subjected to an investigation, acquitted, and released 3 months after his capture. Bizot was the only foreigner to have been so fortunate. 20 years later, upon learning of the arrest of Duch, the memories came rushing back, and he wrote a book about his experiences during this turbulent period. The book is called The Gate. Another 10 years went by, Duch's trial began, and Bizot, who had seen his jailer several times in the interim, was called to testify. The most disturbing experience that Bizot recounted of his capture was the closeness he felt to Duch. The latter was not yet the executioner responsible for the death of some 40,000 prisoners in the S-21 prison camp, but he was already a ruthless Khmer leader. Yet, Bizot also had to admit, and this disturbed him immensely, that Dutch was by no means a monster, a pervert, or a madman, that he resembled other human beings, and therefore Bizot himself. It should be kept in mind to attenuate this radical equation that in Europe at the beginning of the 70s, the Khmer Rouge did not by any means trigger the same revulsion as today. They were in fact seen in a favorable light. During the Vietnam War, European public opinion was predominantly hostile to Americans, and as a result, it was receptive to those who fought against them. The French government supported the Khmer Rouge, and the West applauded when they took power in 1975, seeing them as modern leaders who would pull the country out of its feudal backwardness. In addition, the enlightened young people in Europe at the time readily subscribed to Maoism, and they too believed in the radiant future. In Cambodia, Bizot had to acknowledge that the conduct of the revolutionary cadres stood out favorably against the behavior of corrupt civil servants, and that it demonstrated moral uprightness and integrity. In fact, he owed his freedom to this. As he later discovered, the decision to release him had been made by Dutch's superior, who had held onto his principles of fairness. This act of clemency was far from the only proof of their human qualities. Dutch, he writes, was a serious young man looking for truth, deeply concerned with justice, and ready to sacrifice his life for the goals of the revolution. According to Bizot, at the same time, being a soldier of the revolution didn't prevent him from acting like any other human being, with the ability to laugh merrily or to love. In different situations, the same individual can act in ways that are typically appreciated by others. In the years preceding his arrest, Dutch had converted to Christianity and worked with humanitarian organizations. The great crimes of the Khmer Rouge were not the work of sadists or the mentally ill. They resulted from reactions familiar to everyone. One of these stems from the feeling that you and your loved ones are in mortal danger, the conviction that at this very moment you have to kill to avoid being killed, that you may also have to torture to obtain information indispensable to protecting yourself and those who are close to you. Another comes from the desire to improve the current state of affairs for yourself and your community. If the goal is truly sublime, then it justifies all sacrifices and all suffering inflicted. The Khmer Rouge dreamed of a purified society, purged of its enemies, at long last delivered from evil. The end seemed to justify the means. Big criminals are often described as beasts. In point of fact, human beings find reasons for the massacres they commit precisely in what distinguishes them from animals. It would be better to stop using the adjective human as a compliment, which doesn't imply that it should be turned into an insult either. Animals kill to eat and to defend themselves. People do so to protect themselves against dangers that often exist only in their imagination, or to accomplish projects of their own devising. Revolutionary utopianism boils down to an invention of the mind that people try to turn into a reality by force. What people have over animals is the faculty of abstraction, of imagination dissociated from reality, of forming mental constructs unrelated to present-day experience. They can imagine other people's representations and manipulate them. This is also how they can become a danger for the survival of humanity. Finding that the big criminals in history are as human as we are is one of the movements that allows us to get closer to them. The other consists in discerning what there is in us that is reminiscent of what we see in them. Seeing that they are human or that we are capable of becoming inhuman amounts to the same thing. This was Bizot's experience in captivity. Not knowing if he would be released, he made the project to run away at all costs. To defend himself during his flight, he managed to get a stone with a sharp edge that he kept carefully hidden, and he was prepared to use it. From the moment I decided to escape, he writes, I couldn't imagine encountering anyone, even a child, without killing him, or else running the risk of letting him escape and sound the alarm. And so to defend his own life, he was ready to commit a murder of a child if necessary. Is this so different from the state of mind of the Khmer Rouge? At another point, Bizot found himself taking malicious pleasure in manipulating his jailer. And with this enjoyment, he writes, it occurred to me that in his place, I too would have had what it takes to be a good torturer. If Bizot did not become a torturer or a murderer, it wasn't because he wasn't made of the same stuff. He was simply lucky enough during his captivity not to have to kill, and the rest of the time to live in a state based on the rule of law, alone empowered to use violence legitimately. He also had the good fortune not to believe that human beings should take God's place and create a new world inhabited by a new species. In other words, the difference between executioners and victims doesn't lie in the biological nature of individuals. There is no DNA specific to murderers. It proceeds from the different circumstances in which the destiny of one individual or another unfolds. The individual past matters. People whose childhood was steeped in love and those who were brought up the hard way will not react in the same way. Growing up in an atmosphere of political and social despair conditions you differently than if all the doors open easily before you. The present-day context also matters. We don't react the same way in a peaceful setting as we do when faced with the threat of death, be it real or imaginary. Wars do not reveal the deep-seated nature of human beings. They generate attitudes that are absent in other situations. Yet we have great difficulty accepting the identity of nature between the big criminals and ourselves. We'd rather think of Hitler, Eichmann, Mao, and Pol Pot as monsters alien to the human species. We feign rather than feel incomprehension. Probably the only merit of humiliating photos from the American prison of Abu Ghraib in Iraq was to show us that the torturers are not aliens from outer space or bloodthirsty monsters, but ordinary, smiling boys and girls who could have been our children or our neighbors. This doesn't mean that the human species is utterly dreadful and can only be deplored, but rather that we have an equal potential for good as for evil. The hope of attaining a state that is free once and for all of evil is vain, and there is nothing that means such as war, executions, or prison can do about that. But the acknowledgement that there is evil inside us and that we are obliged to live with it is difficult to accept. We would rather raise a high barrier between the monsters and ourselves, holding them up to opprobrium in the belief that we are fundamentally different and wondering how such beings could even have existed. What good can come in these conditions from the forthcoming trial against former Khmer Rouge leaders for crimes against humanity? 30 years after the events, all we have left are a few old men who will probably end their lives in prison. It will never be possible to punish them in a way commensurate with their crimes. Will this trial, which resembles no other, present them as individuals that are totally different from others? That would be a regrettable outcome. Bizot deems the condemnation necessary, but he dreams of another kind of trial, one that would allow us to discover the true nature of the danger that threatens us and that lurks within. He writes, "I see the crime against humanity as a gaze that can be suddenly pointed at us. I'd like us to have the audacity to humanize the torturers without trying to forgive them or minimize their crimes, to see in them what human beings are capable of being, what we are capable of being." It is striking to note that those who are eager for the trial to take place are not necessarily those who suffered directly from the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge and who have been brought today to live alongside their former torturers. It is rather their children and children's children, many of whom live abroad, and international public opinion that are intent on seeing justice done. A survey of the Human Rights Center of the University of California at Berkeley, conducted in September 2008, concerning the attitude of Cambodian population towards the trial, shows that 80% of the persons interrogated consider themselves victims of the Khmer Rouge, that 77% testify of their hatred towards them, and that 68% expect a positive effect on the victims. However, at the same time, only 2% out of them mention the accomplishment of justice as their present priority. The immense majority is concerned, in the first place, by their present daily lives rather than by the punishment of former crimes. The Cambodian peasants who survived the purges and stayed have been living in proximity to former Khmer Rouge troops for years. They obviously don't approve of the past acts of their present-day neighbors, but they have reached a form of reconciliation. They understand that the Khmer Rouge killed and tortured under the threat, real or imaginary, of being killed themselves by their enemies or by their own comrades. They understand that in their place, in all likelihood, they would have done the same. We can see here that the treatment to which we subject a traumatic past can pursue two goals that don't coincide: the reign of abstract justice, where crimes are punished and exploits recompensed, or the moral well-being of individuals who make up the population and in whose name justice is being rendered. There are other areas in the world where people have deliberately chosen to emphasize not the sentencing of criminals by trial, but the reconciliation of formerly opposed populations. To achieve reconciliation, some 20-odd countries recently liberated from dictatorial regimes in Latin America, Africa, and Asia have set up committees of sages mandated to find out the truth about what happened in the past. Among them, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa has become the best known one. After the abolition of apartheid and the first free elections in '94, the commission was set up under the presidency of the Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu and held hearings from '95 to '98. Its way of treating collective memory, and in this case a particularly painful memory, is worthy of attention. Here I will follow mainly Desmond Tutu's account of its work. The new leaders of the country quickly made a twofold decision: to look the past in the eye, and to do so without recourse to the usual solutions in such cases. On the one hand, what can be called the Nuremberg trial option was not an example to follow, not only due to its intrinsic flaws, like the presence among the judges of Soviets no less criminal than the Nazis, or the inclusion of charges of crimes against peace in the trials, but also because South Africa was an altogether different case. In Nuremberg, the victorious Allies had judged the vanquished Germans and punished them for the suffering that they inflicted. The victors had chosen a small group of people in charge and executed them, after which they left the Germans to themselves. In South Africa, there had been no military victory, and the apartheid had been brought to an end on the condition that there would be no settling of scores. The dominators and the dominated, those who had profited from the old regime and those who had suffered from it, had to continue to living with one another. In addition, the apartheid regime had lasted much longer than Nazism, and a very large part of the white population had been implicated in what could be regarded in hindsight as reprehensible acts. Punishing them all was impossible. These crimes were committed in agreement with laws and according to government directives. To bring the perpetrators to justice, the state would have to cover the costs of judging a huge number of people. On the other hand, an Edict of Nantes type solution was equally undesirable. This term describes the attempt, following Henry IV's example in 1598, to impose not only general amnesty, but also collective amnesia. As it states, let the memory of all things that have taken place on both sides remain extinguished and dormant as something that has not occurred. This option was impossible because apartheid had filtered into every nook and cranny of coexistence between whites and blacks to a much greater degree than the religious conflicts had penetrated 16th century society. This option was also undesirable because it is hard to imagine that such a deliberate collective suppression could really transform memory and bring peace. Apartheid lasted nearly 50 years in principle and much longer in practice. Opposition to it was itself very old, and the struggles between the two sides belong to its history. For this reason, the oppressed have often played the part of fighters, and their acts require scrutiny in turn. Judging the perpetrators would be all the more difficult inasmuch as their victims had committed comparable crimes. The African National Congress, the party that had struggled against apartheid, didn't deem itself guilty of wrongdoing. It is legitimate, its leaders thought, that if even one uses the same means as the enemy, one doesn't resemble him because the cause we defend is different. Since the war conducted by the ANC was just, its militants couldn't have violated human rights and had nothing to justify before the panel. But the member of the commissions didn't agree. In keeping with the Geneva Conventions that regulate the conduct to be held in war, they demanded that the means employed be themselves legitimate. If the victims were sometimes guilty, the culprits, for their part, had motives that were readily understandable in context. The country was at war, and the government had asked them to fight the enemy. We didn't enjoy doing this, states one person in front of the committee. We didn't want to do this, but we had to stop them from killing innocent women and children. Once started down this road, it was easy to accept mutilating the bodies to camouflage the origin of the killings, or torturing prisoners to get information and prevent new attacks. The enemies were presented as inhuman, bloodthirsty individuals taking part in a final communist assault on the last bulwark of the free world in Africa. Torture and killings took place in Cambodia in the name of communism, in South Africa in the name of anti-communism. Fighting was necessary to defend one's own life and the lives of the other members of the community, and to neutralize terrorists. The pressure on soldiers and policemen was such that they were conditioned to strike and kill, which didn't mean that they ceased being ordinary people with reactions that we can all understand. Tutu concludes, "As I listened in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the stories of perpetrators of human rights violations, I realized how each of us has this capacity for the most awful evil, every one of us. What he decides from this is not that the crime does not deserve punishment, but that the crime is not to be conflated with the criminal. What remains to be done when legal condemnation and imposed forgetting have been rejected? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission proposed the following response. The victims would appear before it with their testimonies, and if the latter were corroborated, they would receive compensation from the state. Perpetrators of human rights violations and of political crimes would be encouraged to appear and publicly confess their crimes. If corroborating evidence showed that they had told the whole truth, they would be amnestied and could no longer be brought to court for these acts. Testimonies and confessions played a cathartic role. Victims received public recognition, while offenders were humiliated before the nation. The hearings were widely reported in the papers and broadcast on radio and television. Thus, the first goal of the enterprise was attained, namely, to establish the truth, not a scientifically or legally confirmed truth, based on collecting material evidence, but one that resides in an agreement between the two parties. In its turn, this consensus, this image adopted by the collectivity, opened the way to the ultimate goal of forgiving and reconciliation, the state in which a part of the population, the white minority, publicly accepted its past guilt, and the other part, the black or colored majority, tried to overcome its resentment. One might add that in the eyes of the Commission members themselves, part of this agenda, the payment of compensation, was far from being sufficiently carried out by the government. It is common these days to pit vengeance against justice and to prefer the latter to the former. Vengeance is carried out by the initial victim or the victim's representative, and it is meant to inflict a punishment equivalent to the offense. A tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. The judge's aim is not to avenge the injured party, but to restore social order. But in the South African case, the opposition was between two types of justice. Punitive justice, which uses means such as execution and imprisonment and aims exclusively at the application of the law, and restorative justice, which uses other means of punishment and pursues the welfare of the community. Social harmony, writes Tutu, is for us the summum bonum, the greatest good. Anything that subverts, that undermines this sought-after good is to be avoided like the plague. Punitive justice, in other words, differs from vengeance in a double manner. First of all, instead of punishing the community, the family, the clan, or the tribe, it sticks to the individual responsibility of the wrongdoer. Secondly, the punishment itself is inflicted not by individuals, such as the parents of the assassinated person, but by the representatives of the state or the law. Thanks to these differences, justice, as opposed to vengeance, manages to interrupt the cycle of reprisals. However, concerning the nature of the punishment itself, the two often coincide. Lex talionis is not abandoned. The person who has killed must be killed. The person who has caused suffering must suffer. From this perspective, vengeance appears to be private justice, whereas justice is a kind of public vengeance. And the fact that punitive justice is decided not by the individual, but by collective law, does not suffice to oppose the two. The law itself is the expression of the collective will. Punitive justice privileges the abstract law and the institution that represents it, which is, in the final analysis, the state. Restorative justice is concerned first and foremost with the individual people who make up the society. Its purpose is not to protect an impersonal order, but to enable former perpetrators and former victims to live side by side. It seeks not to punish, but to restore relations that should never have been interrupted. An illustration of the contrast between the two can be found in a recent statement of American President Barack Obama addressing the Turkish parliament in April of this year. Introducing a theme quite close to the theme of the present lecture, as a matter of fact, he observes that all democracies, as they move to the future, confront an issue: how we deal with the past, adding, the US is still working through some of our own darker periods in our history. But given the audience he was addressing in this case, Obama preferred to deal with another example, the Armenian massacres in Turkey in 1915, and the question whether they should be qualified as a genocide. His conclusion was the following: while there's been a good deal of commentary about my views, it's really about how the Turkish and Armenian people deal with the past. I interpret this sentence to mean that although he himself, Obama, personally believes that these acts amounted to a genocide, the right formulation would be the one that has a bigger chance to bring peace and mutual understanding to these two peoples, Turks and Armenians. The South African Commission was seen very favorably throughout the world, and several foreign countries contributed to its funding. Its foremost protagonists, Mandela and Tutu, acquired a status of exceptional sages. Yet, surprisingly enough, no one seems to have felt the urge to follow their example and set up a system of restorative rather than punitive justice. South African journalist Antje Krog, author of a seminal book on the Commission's work, had this to say about admirers of the experience, among them many heads of state. Although they themselves will leave no stone unturned to hold offenders before their courts, they hug Mandela for forgiving those who murdered his people. Bringing home a picture of themselves next to Mandela seems to have been the only ambition of these chiefs of state. Their practice is something else entirely, as is evidenced in the way they handle crimes against humanity from the past and deal with today's terrorist crimes. The execution of Saddam Hussein and several of his close collaborators after the fall of the Ba'athist dictatorship in Iraq is further proof that the South African example has not taken hold. The need for vengeance prevailed over the spirit of reconciliation, even though it is highly likely that by acting in this way, the Iraqis have sowed the seeds of conflict for decades to come. It is by no means clear that restorative justice must supplant punitive justice at all times. Tutu himself argued that it is applicable only in specific cases, in particular when the crimes were committed in accordance with legislation rejected after the collapse of a totalitarian or military dictatorship, and when they were part of a mass phenomenon. Even when both conditions are fulfilled, there can be exceptions, like in the case of crimes against humanity, of genocide, and when the accused are not merely executing orders, but are instrumental in the conception of these massacres. Heads of state that set them in motion and their closest collaborators. In such cases, a public confession can seem to be of little account, but how should they be punished? The summary executions of Nicolae Ceausescu and Saddam Hussein don't seem to me satisfying any more than the impunity enjoyed by Pol Pot and Pinochet. I wonder sometimes if it wouldn't be better, as a punishment for crimes against humanity, to hand such great slaughterers over to the United Nations, which would confiscate their property and put them together on some desert island in the middle of the ocean, like St. Helena, where Napoleon was exiled in the 19th century. As for the perpetrators of ordinary crimes who crowd prison cells, it may be worthwhile to broaden the sphere of application of the restorative option to cover their cases too. Crimes that are in no way political could also be expiated in society rather than by imprisonment. The two paths could become complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Let me summarize the points I was raising in this discussion. The memory of the past, I believe, will serve no purpose if used to build an impassable wall between evil and us, identifying exclusively with irreproachable heroes and innocent victims, and driving the agents of evil outside the confines of humankind. This, though, is precisely what we usually do. In everyday life, too, we easily forget the harm we have inflicted, but hold on to the memory of the harm we have endured. And for good reasons. We don't feel the suffering of others. Therefore, the remedy we are seeking will not consist in merely remembering the evil of which our group or our ancestors were victims. We have to go a step further and ask ourselves about the reasons that gave rise to this evil. The foul beast is not in some remote place outside of us. It is within. Romain Gary, the great French novelist of the second half of 20th century, who fought against the Germans as a pilot, already reached this conclusion in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The criminal element in the German is man, he wrote, later adding, "What's dreadful in Nazism, they say, is its inhuman side." True. But let's face the fact, this inhuman dimension is part of what's human. As long as we refuse to recognize that inhumanity is a human thing, we'll remain caught in a pious fraud. The word human is not a suitable synonym for generous or merciful. This is why human beings will never be delivered from evil. Our only hope is not to eradicate it definitively, but to try to understand it, to contain and to tame it, recognizing that it is also present within us. In fact, the Gospels themselves suggest a prudent interpretation of the prayer. Rather than asking God to deliver human beings from evil once and for all, Christ asks him to keep them from evil. This doesn't mean that we should direct all our vindictiveness against ourselves as individuals or as a people, remembering only the dark pages of our past, overburdening ourselves with reproaches, and condemning ourselves to live in penitence and to demonstrate continual contrition. Evil is not to be identified with us more than with others, and good itself is omnipresent and even commonplace. Even less does this mean that we should refrain from moral judgment. Our adversary here is not morality, but egocentricity and Manichaeism. Simply put, it is not individuals or groups of individuals who are bad, but their deeds. The memory of the past could help us in this enterprise of taming evil, on the condition that we keep in mind that good and evil flow from the same source, and that in the world's best narratives, they are not neatly divided. Thank you. Sure.
Well, thank you for those extremely important and thought-provoking remarks. We have about 20 minutes or so for questions, and so I'd like to invite you, if you have a question, to raise your hand, wait for Professor Todorov to acknowledge you, and then please stand up and speak so that everyone in the room can hear. It's a large room, and it is difficult to hear. We have a microphone, so even better. Wait, we have two microphones. Wait till one of the microphones arrives and then speak into the microphone. So I'll invite you to acknowledge the questions. Thank you.
There is a question here.
Oh, I think I was lucky enough to get the first mic.
Sure.
This was a really great talk, and I've often said that the American Army recruiting slogan, "Be all that you can be," is a terrible slogan, because if each of us were everything that we could possibly be, we would surely be massive evildoers, as well as people fulfilling our highest potential. One thing that this talk brought to mind was a case that my students and I, many of whom are with me today in performance and television, we've been studying the case of Littleton and the Columbine massacres, and the role that media played in inspiring the students who murdered their fellow students and then shot themselves. Your talk is about remedy, but there's also the question of prevention, where your talk began. And I'm wondering if you can say more about, if we feel compassion towards killers, towards those who would do evil unto others, how does that result in prevention of future evil? Is prevention possible?
I don't think that a kind of radical prevention is possible, because this would mean that we are definitively delivered from evil. And evil, of course, is only a shortcut here, a way of designating a variety of reasons which can be concretely the reason of what is going on. I think, for instance, of this trial that is taking place right now, these days, in Phnom Penh, of this torturer and executioner, Duch, responsible for the murder and suffering of tens of thousands of people. I think that we won't prevent the reoccurrence of this by being compassionate to him. I don't think that the point is so much to be compassionate to him. It so happens that this man, Duch, understands that he committed unforgivable acts, although he asks to be forgiven, but he hopes that this is a kind of distant effect. But I think it is important in this context that we don't exclude someone like Duch from humanity. And this, in a way, is a lesson for us. And this may help preventing, because if we do that, if we don't exclude him from humanity, we will be interested to understand the reasons for which he became a mass torturer and a mass killer. This is the only positive outcome. It is not our compassion, but our inclusion of this person within the realm of humanity, so that what we can observe on him applies to us as well. So it's only an indirect help of prevention, not directly eliminating the danger, as I understand it. So there is a second question.
Thank you. Several years ago, Ward Churchill sparked a tremendous controversy by suggesting that the victims of the terror attack at the World Trade Center were, in some sense, unwittingly complicit in the events that led up to their own destruction, and referred to them as little Eichmanns because of their role in the globalizing economy that he charged had in some ways spawned the terrorism that the country was subject to. Ward Churchill, a professor in the Middle West. And his thesis stirred some rediscussion of Hannah Arendt's thesis of the banality of evil and the role of Eichmanns within gigantic military-industrial style complexes or genocide machines that in some way are bureaucrats, and yet they are the epitome of evil, as Hannah Arendt viewed it. And I just wondered, listening to some of your remarks, I felt that I sensed overtones of Hannah Arendt's thesis, and I wondered if you could comment on her thesis and the larger question of how pervasive evil in its banal form might be in our society, in the bureaucracies that we've created, that some would argue play such a big role in creating the evils that we've been subjected to.
This is indeed a large question. And it would imply a long answer. In a way, the general idea of banality of evil, which was not an invention of Arendt's, although she gave it the most popular form, but was also defended by various other survivors of World War II who were sensitive to this fact, I think is an important step forward in this general form, because precisely it does not divide humanity in two qualitatively different tribes, one that is capable of committing monstrous acts and the other that can only be victim of these acts. And the less we understand, the better. And you know that this has become also just as popular as the banality of evil formula. There is another formula about there is nothing to be understood, no understanding here. We should abstain from any attempt to understand because this would imply that we are ready to excuse and so on and so forth. There are some more specific aspects to Arendt's thesis, which I don't think I'll be entering here, namely the fact that the evil itself was not banal by all means. It was not the evil itself was not banal, but probably someone like Eichmann was a banal person. However, what he committed was not a banal act. Now, the idea that the victims of the terrorist acts are themselves collaborating and guilty of what was inflicted on others strikes me as very far away from the common sense ground on which I'm trying to remain, because I really cannot see how we could deduce one from the other. It's sort of work of an academic, not of ordinary human being. But I can understand, nevertheless, the question, the way you put it, whether those who contribute to further destructions through their voting or their work in bureaucratic institutions, whether they should be held responsible. After all, the victims of 9/11 were about 3,000, and the victims of the Iraq War, which had nothing to do at all with 9/11, were about 600,000. So in a way, one could wonder whether all those who voted and imposed, in a way, or facilitated the politics of the government, which provoked these 600,000 deaths, were not, in a way, responsible. To my mind, this would also, I can understand the question better than the earlier one, but I wouldn't agree with this extension of collective responsibility. There are too many mediations between the two, and I think that the responsibility lies with those who make the decisions, not those who have elected the person who made the decision. This was not at stake at the moment of the election. So I wouldn't extend responsibility in such a way which would make us all guilty all the time for all the crimes committed on earth, and in a way dissolves the very idea of guilt and responsibility. Here, another question.
Actually, I have the microphone.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sure.
So just we were talking about the reconciliation process, and I just wonder, do you think that the reconciliation process actually deals with the crimes that have been committed in a way that will reduce the likelihood of such things happening again, or can it also actually repress those feelings for a time and perhaps intensify them so that they pop out later on in an equal or even greater expression of evil acts? And I can think of many and right now where people are advocating for letting bygones be bygones, and I know that personally my own reaction is, well, okay, I can see the value of doing that so that the greater needs of society are met, but at the same time, personally, I feel rage that people can get away with terrible acts. And yes, it's in the name of reconciliation and moving on, but isn't there some good served by making sure that people pay some kind of price, or at least that the rest of society is shown that this is not acceptable, that you can't simply get away with it?
Well, of course, this is the question concerning that kind of committee. And since I was quoting approvingly Desmond Tutu, it would be clear that in a way I prefer his way of dealing, but I understand very well, of course, your question and objection to this stand. And I'd say that it is very much present in the debate nowadays, in Europe in particular maybe, because we have this terrible past with so many violent crimes committed in the last decades, whereas the history of America is a broad, shining way and doesn't have that kind of difficulty. But we do. One of the examples I feel very much concerned about is what happened to the communist countries of Eastern Europe, which were submitted to a very strong and painful oppression and dictatorship. And after 89 and 90, when the communist regimes collapsed, in fact, no punishment has been devised in any of these countries. And there are some processes here and there of lustrification and so on, in Poland, in Czechia. But in the overall picture, it has been left like that. And indeed, it raises a question whether this is not something like more like a Freudian repression rather than reconciliation. And as we know, repression may become the source of neurosis and of violent outbursts years later. Another example, very recent example, was the attempt of the Spanish judge Garzón, who became famous by indicting Pinochet at one point, to open the trials of the Franco era by digging up the graves of executed people during the Civil War, and thus opening the cases. So this is indeed a sort of burning issue. My personal judgment on this is the following. I think that one should give all latitude to historians to throw as much as possible light on what happened. But on the other hand, that there should be a time limitation about crimes, even the worst crimes. A time limitation because human beings change, and also because, as I argued in the lecture, it is not necessarily true that our abstract aim should be the accomplishment of justice, this feeling of injustice that you describe in yourself, and I think any one of us can experience. This is not the only possible aim of these interventions. Another one being the well-being of the community. And this may imply, indeed, the lack of this abstract justice, giving this justification that if it were imposed, it would nourish further tensions and aggressions. I think this is also the meaning of Obama's recommendation to the Turkish parliament. He was immediately condemned by some Armenian militant groups for having abandoned his earlier stand, which was that this was indeed a genocide. But I think he was right in claiming that the important thing today, almost 100 years after the massacres or the genocide, it was more important to find a way in which these two communities could live together again, rather than establishing the abstract judicial truth. If even we feel, each one of us personally may feel that, yes, it could have been called a genocide at the time. But this is not the only criterion for judging the appropriateness of an action today. That's more or less the answer I can give. There is a question there. Here.
I hear your use of the term evil as if it were part of the ontology of the marvelous. That is, as if it inhabited a world that sustained supernatural emanations, spirit emanations, as if it had a certain sort of metaphysical status in this reality. And I'm wondering if you were to redescribe evil as in terms of the uncanny, as part of the constituents of the ordinary, would it look different? I mean, do we need this metaphysical notion of evil as a pervasive presence, self-sustaining in some way, penetrating the ordinary to make sense of what's going on here?
Oh, definitely. I thought that was what I was doing. Since the whole point is to say that it has nothing supernatural, and in a way, the very use of the word evil is in a way misleading, because I'm using just one word to cover a large variety of acts. This is just a shorthand. It corresponds to torture, to violent crimes, and all sorts of things that we all know about. But we condemn them as if they were evil acts. So in order not to use all the time periphrases and descriptions, I call them evil. But I don't believe in evil as such. I don't believe that there is an axis of evil crossing the world and that we have to fight it and so on. No, it is just a convenience adopted here, maybe an inappropriate convenience,
Thank
but
you.
That's the idea. Yes, there is a question. Yeah.
May I?
Sure.
So you touched briefly on the issue of how a consensus is reached to pursue some kind of justice, whichever kind it might be, and that process seems to be partly political and partly in the realm of foreign relations. And I'm wondering, as an outside observer, if you have any opinion on where the United States is in that process in terms of addressing what we've done in the last few years, both in the realm of torture and in the realm of preemptive war. Because it seems like we're having a struggle right now to try to start some kind of process. And at least, maybe I'm impatient, but it seems slow.
Well, I have written and published on this, and I have been, in my own tiny way, always opposed to the idea of preventive war, to say nothing of torture. So I share your preoccupations, and at the same time, I don't really feel competent enough to comment on the speed sufficient or insufficient that nowadays is being performed in the elimination of these actions. But I'm, of course, as many Europeans, I'm sure, very sensitive to the fact that the new American president declared that he is suspending torture and has the project of eliminating Guantanamo and so on and so forth. And I hope that the doctrine of preventive war will be revised as well. I must say, because you're asking me about this, that I don't share, however, the universal admiration for the foreign policy of the new administration, namely concerning the war in Afghanistan, which to me is not really more promising than the war in Iraq. however this may be debated. There are many opinions on the subject.
So these are quite clearly questions that could occupy us in conversation and discussion for a very long time, and in fact should do so, but not any longer here at this moment. So please join me in thanking Tzvetan Todorov. Thank you. Thank you all. Very, very, very.